Hey, everybody, this is a lecture on the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a transformative time for the United States of America. It really was transformative because of how it changed the relationship between United States citizens and its government. The role of the government changed, it became more active in people's lives, and it actually changed the relationship between citizens and the government. And in fact, in 1929, Calvin Coolidge said, if the government went out, it would take 6 months for people to even notice. And this would greatly change during the Great Depression. There was a lot of personal impacts of the Great Depression. Specifically, people, especially men supporting families, felt a great sense of failure. There was a sense of dread, helplessness, hopelessness, a lack of belief in the future. And in fact, birth rates, divorce rates, and marriage rates plummeted during this time. And people didn't want another mouth to feed. They didn't want to have to support somebody that they didn't feel they could. Um, and it was just a very, very difficult time. Divorce rates, people couldn't afford to actually have a divorce. The Great Depression, to understand it fully, you need to have some numbers. And so here's a little bit of data for you. By 1930, 100,000 people were unemployed in the United States of America. Each week for the next 2 to 3 years, an additional 100,000 people lost their jobs. And so, at the very height of the Great Depression, we have about 13 million people unemployed. So, if you think of Clallam County, we have 35,000 or so here. So, triple that. And so, that number of people per week for 2 to 3 years in the United States are losing their jobs. It was pretty horrific. So the Great Depression was especially hard on African Americans, farmers, and immigrants. So, first of all, African Americans and immigrants, they didn't have the same rights as their white counterparts. There was a lot of prejudice and a lot of issues, dealing with the history of immigration and of, slave labor. Also, farmers struggled during this time, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Before Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, the government was spending about $3 billion on their budget, and after the New Deal, it was $6 billion. So FDR was pretty controversial. A lot of people thought he went too far helping individuals during this time, and some people felt he didn't do enough to help people during this time through government assistance. Another thing, data wise, to keep in mind is the stock market crashed. It crashed, but there was a lot of reasons why it crashed, and we'll get to that again in just a second. But in 1929, it was worth 87 billion, and by 1933, it was only worth 18 billion. So that's a little data for you. All right, the causes of the great markets crash. By 1929, there was a very small group of people, of companies, controlling the overall market. And as you recall, after the Gilded Age, there were groups of progressives that provided legislation or pushed through legislation to protect individuals from government greed, sorry, corporate greed. And a lot of these things were overturned throughout the 1920s, good, bad, or otherwise. It just happened. And this was a part of the why the stock market crashed. Unemployment was still fairly high. Some companies grew too fast. Farmers were struggling and farm prices were falling already. In 1921, 25% of the national income belonged to farmers. So they were doing fairly well. But by 1929, 9% of the national income belonged to farmers. And there was a variety of reasons for that. So an image of, a farm in the looks like 1920s. A lot of farmers during this time did not want government relief. And so they were advertising that this farm is not, being run by government relief. So there was also a growing gap between the rich and the poor. 75% of all wealth belonged to the top 1% in the country at this time. And partially because some of those government programs were undone in the 1920s. Many goods produced, but people couldn't buy them. They couldn't afford them. There was increasing gaps between rural and urban.